everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Xavier Wrona. I'm an architect and I was invited by Eric to have a carte blanche. Is that something that exists in English? Carte blanche,
yeah.
like about how to look at the city after the events of the, let's say, 13th of November, or mass shootings, or and so this is meant to be, first of all, this is meant to be an experiment. It's not a debate, or it's not a. It is an attempt to try to think collectively in different terms. And it's so, as such, it can fail. I do not expect it to necessarily be a success, but it's a training which out of which I think something will get out in terms of how to try to reconstruct other ways of thinking collectively. It's as much an attempt to generate a form than it is to generate meaning or content or so. Maybe we started a bit. No, please come. So we tried to make it a circle, but apparently everybody stacked. But it's true that there's also a screen, so there's room on the other side. So, as an architect, just a bit of very short introduction. As an architect, I'm a bit haunted by the question of totality. How can we, it seems that totality is embedded in the notion of planning, in the way it can organize reality. And so I'm interested in this because it's bound to, I think it's bound to the problem of architecture or urban planning. But also I'm interested in totality, in how we can try to think as a totality, and not, part of the problem could be that architecture, if it deals with totality, it's only dealt with by a few people. So how can we think as a totality? The idea of today's panel is to try to work along the idea of building a totality to think, and not just, so you are all part of this totality. You are all part of the debate, of the discussion, more than the debate, sorry. So please feel free to, the way it's going to go, I have finished this brief introduction. I have a small introduction of all the people around the table, and then there will be 3 parts, which each part will be introduced by a 5-minute video part. I have specific written questions about the person at the table, and once this will be asked and run their course, you are more than welcome to join in. So, the specificity of the people that I chose to contact, that we chose to contact with Natasha and Eric, was to try to have non-specialists. Because when Eric asked me to think of the relationship between what happened in the city, it didn't make sense to me to go back to the usual, I'm a specialist as an architect, I'm a specialist of this built form, let's say. And I've been always trained to work with other specialists, like, urban sociologists, anthropologists about the city, urbanists. And so it didn't feel right to try to use the same knowledge to try to look at how to reconsider the question of the built form, or the built environment. And so to me, it's all, the project of Eric has always been the question of looking at the Medusa, I don't know how, the Gorgon, right? How do we suddenly try to face, what have we done? What is it that we've built? Can we just as simply ask that question? How can we look at this? And so the idea, and that's why the panel was a little tight, difficult to make, because I've asked people to accept to talk about things they are not specialists of, right? And a lot of people do not want to speak about things that they're not specialists of, so I thank all of you for having accepted this. because I think part of the way we should talk about the city is that it's not something of specialists, but it's a collective problem. And so one last thing. No, that's all. So just on the table, so Eric, I'll just read quickly the blurbs that I was given, and then we'll start. Eric Baudelaire is a visual artist and filmmaker. His films Letter to Max 2014, The Ugly One 2013, The Anabasis of May and Fusako Shinegobu Masawa Adachi and 27 Years Without Images, which is the longest title ever, 2011, were shown at the FID, Marseille, Locarno, Toronto, New York, and Rotterdam Film Festival. His research-based practice also unfolds as installations incorporating photography, printmaking, performance, publications, and screenings, which you can see in the exhibition upstairs. Paul Guillibert, he's a PhD student in philosophy in Nanterre University. He is working on the relationship between capitalism and environment. He is also an anti-racist activist and member of the editorial board of the Vacarme journal. Tara Lewis. Tara Lewis is a Rotterdam-based journalist who, amongst other things, writes about her city for NRC Handelsblad. Okay, sorry. VPRO Gids and Verspitten. Yeah, sorry. Okay, which, you know, a Rotterdam-based online magazine for hard thinking. She studied communication and history. Malique Mohamud is an innovator in the Rotterdam cultural sector and self-appointed hip-hop scholar, mainly trying to satisfy his curiosity. He writes, produces, and presents stories and perspectives that typically remain in the eye of the mainstream. In short, Malique doing things. Okay, we're going to start with the first short video.
Io ho scelto una città, la città di Orte, cioè praticamente ho scelto come tema la forma di una città, il profilo di una città. Ecco, quello che vorrei dire è questo. Io ho fatto un'inquadratura che prima faceva vedere soltanto la città di Orte nella sua perfezione stilistica, cioè come forma perfetta, assoluta. Ed è più o meno l'inquadratura così. Basta che io muovo questo affare qui nella macchina da presa ed ecco che la forma della città, il profilo della città, la massa architettonica della città è incrinata, è rovinata, è deturpata da qualcosa di estraneo. Cioè quella casa che si vede là a sinistra, la vedi? Ora, che cos'è che mi dà tanto fastidio? Anzi, direi quasi una specie di dolore, di offesa, di rabbia, la presenza di quelle povere case popolari che comunque devono esserci. Il problema era semmai di costruire da un'altra parte, di prevedere di poter costruire da un'altra parte. Che cos'è che mi offende in loro? È il fatto che appartengono a un altro mondo, hanno caratteri stilistici completamente diversi da quelli dell'antica città di Orte, e la mescolanza delle due cose infastidisce, è un'imprimatura, un turbamento della forma, dello stile. Questo io forse lo soffro in modo particolare, non soltanto perché è un senso estetico forse esagerato, eccessivo, d'anima bella, ma anche perché ho tanto lavorato su dei film storici in cui questo problema era proprio un problema pratico, perché questo non è un difetto solo italiano, ma è un difetto di tutto il mondo ormai, soprattutto del terzo mondo. Non so, per esempio in Persia, dove c'è un regime completamente diverso dal nostro, dove c'è una specie di imperatore, lo Shah, lì succedono le stesse cose, forse ancora peggiori. Per esempio mi viene in mente una stupenda città che si chiama Yazd, sul Golfo Persico vicino al deserto. Una città meravigliosa perché tutte le città avevano un sistema di ventilazione antico, di 2-3 mila anni fa, che era rimasto intatto, delle colonnine che raccoglievano il vento e lo facevano entrare dentro la città. Quindi il panorama della città era dominato da queste specie di ventilatori che sembravano un po' dei tempietti greci, arcaici o egiziani, cioè era una cosa stupenda. Beh, questa città quando sono arrivato lì io era distrutta, come se fosse stato un bombardamento a tappeto. Lo Shah la faceva distruggere per dimostrare ai suoi sudditi e al suo popolo che la Persia era un paese moderno che avanzava, eccetera, eccetera. Eccoci di fronte alla struttura, alla forma, al profilo di un'altra città, immersa in una specie di grigia luce lagunare perché intorno ci sia una stupenda macchia mediterranea. Si tratta di Sabaudia. Quanto abbiamo riso noi intellettuali sull'architettura del regime, sulle città come Sabaudia. Eppure adesso, osservando questa città, proviamo la sensazione assolutamente inaspettata. La sua architettura non ha niente di irreale, di ridicolo. Il passare degli anni ha fatto sì che questa architettura di carattere littorio assuma un carattere, diciamo così, tra metafisico e realistico. Metafisico in un senso veramente europeo della parola, se ricorda mettiamoci l'architettura metafisica di De Chirico. È realistico perché, anche vista da lontano, si sente che le città sono fatte, come si dice un po' retoricamente, a misura d'uomo. Si sente che dentro ci sono delle famiglie costituite in modo regolare, delle persone umane, degli esseri viventi completi, interi, pieni nella loro umiltà. Come ci spieghiamo un fatto simile che ha del miracoloso? Una città ridicola, fascista, che probabilmente ci sembra così incantevole. Bisogna esaminare un po' la cosa, cioè Sabaudia è stata creata dal regime, non c'è dubbio, però non ha niente di fascista in realtà, se non alcuni caratteri esteriori. Allora io penso questo, che il fascismo, il regime fascista, non è stato altro in conclusione che un gruppo di criminali al potere, e questo gruppo di criminali al potere non ha potuto in realtà fare niente, non è riuscito a incidere nemmeno a scalfire lontanamente la realtà dell'Italia. Sicché Sabaudia, benché ordinata dal regime secondo certi criteri di carattere razionalistico, estetizzante, accademico, non trova le sue radici nel regime che l'ha ordinata, ma trova le sue radici in quella realtà che il fascismo ha dominato tirannicamente ma che non è riuscito a scalfire, cioè è la realtà dell'Italia provinciale, rustica, palo-industriale, eccetera, eccetera, che ha prodotto Sabaudia e non il fascismo. Ora invece succede il contrario, il regime è un regime democratico, eccetera, eccetera, però quella acculturazione, quella omologazione che il fascismo non è riuscito assolutamente a ottenere, il potere di oggi, cioè il potere delle civiltà di consumo, invece riesce a ottenere perfettamente, distruggendo le varie realtà particolari, togliendo realtà ai vari modi di essere uomini che l'Italia ha prodotto in modo storicamente molto differenziato. E allora questa acculturazione sta distruggendo in realtà l'Italia. E allora io posso dire senz'altro che il vero fascismo è proprio questo potere delle civiltà di consumi che sta distruggendo l'Italia. E questa cosa è venuta talmente rapidamente che forse non ce ne siamo resi conto, è venuto tutto in questi ultimi 5, 6, 7, 10 anni. È stata una specie di incubo in cui abbiamo visto l'Italia intorno a noi distruggere, sparire, adesso risvegliandoci forse da questo incubo e guardandoci intorno ci accorgiamo che non c'è più niente da fare.
So that was the first extract. The other ones are a little shorter. Eric, you come first. So you are labeled as an artist now, but your training, if I'm correct, your only training was political science. One could claim that you incidentally are an artist, meaning by this that you are that you are, through other forms, you are producing through other forms now, political science, other forms that are the one usually addressed within political science. And the city is a form. The city is a form, has a form. Through this exhibition, I know your work quite well, but I did not have realized how much the theme or of the city is present throughout your entire work. Like terrorism or forms, it seems that the city can be one common thread of what you're working on. And so Masao Adachi, to which you're referring as, I don't know if you know, he has a sort of so-called theory, which is not called Fouqueyron, which you might, which is about, if I restate it too quickly, from his point of view, he claims terrorism is a question of landscape. So, does your understanding of the links between the form of the environment and what is labeled as terrorism overlap Adachi's understanding? Or did the experience of this movie that you just did, Akahat Jihadi, reveal a different analysis for you? What did you learn, if anything, on this question by making this film?
Well, hopefully I learned a bunch of things, but hopefully the film itself or the work itself doesn't sort of propose any answers, but rather rephrases the questions. I mean, that's what I would hope. But maybe just to talk specifically about this idea of the relationship between the city, landscape, and terrorism. Maybe it's important to be precise about a few things. The first thing I would be precise about is in using the term terrorism, we need obviously to be very careful. The reason why I use it in the context of Masao Adachi is because Masao Adachi refers to himself as a terrorist. He was convicted of terrorism because he was a member of the Japanese Red Army, which was a left-wing revolutionary group that dedicated its work in solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And he, as opposed to many other former extreme left or hard left militant groups, I like the way he thinks back about it. He doesn't repudiate previous activities or ideas. He doesn't sort of try to make excuses for previous things that he probably wouldn't do the same way again. And he says something very beautiful in one of the films that's shown upstairs. He says that society labels me an ex-terrorist, but I don't think the label X applies to terrorism. That being said, he was interested in what he called the theory of landscape, which was with the Fouqueyron. Fouquet in Japanese means landscape, and so Fouqueyron has been assimilated with this idea of a theory of landscape. But what he's saying is not really making a relationship between landscape and terrorism. He's making a relationship between structures of power and landscape. And he's suggesting that, and this is 1969, right? So in 1969, there's a tradition of documentary filmmaking, engaged documentary filmmaking, which is turning the camera at the subject. So, you know, the worker struggling in 1968 in the streets in Tokyo against, you know, the expropriation of certain farms in the suburbs of Tokyo because they were going to build Narita Airport. So they expropriated land from peasants and workers. Those peasants and workers organized, tried to fight the state to keep their land. The state crushed them. Ogawa, which was a collective of filmmakers, made a film about this struggle, and the camera is always on the worker, which is understandable because it's the worker's struggle. Masao Adachi just suggested something, which is to say, what happens if you turn the camera 180 degrees? So you don't film the worker, you film what the worker sees. Because then what you would be filming, ostensibly, is what Japan has become in 1968, 1969, and perhaps within this landscape, you could decipher structures, power structures, that may help explain certain acts of violence that would otherwise be unexplainable. In the case of Masao Adachi's film in 1969, there's an excerpt of it upstairs on a little TV monitor. It's called A.K.A. Serial Killer, and he was interested in an incident where a young 19-year-old man stole a gun from an American army base and killed 5 or 6 people in the streets randomly, seemingly randomly, never explained why. And when he was in prison, he didn't speak. And so Masao Adachi said, well, let's make a film about this young man, called it AKA Serial Killer. And he decided to film all the landscapes in which this young man had lived his life. And this, I think that the assumption is that the murder was not an act of insanity. The murder was related to certain conditions, structures you could call them, of Japanese society that had created the conditions, the objective conditions for his sort of crazy killings. But that it's a very materialist and Marxist analysis, which is to say that there is something within the structure that can explain this individual gesture, and perhaps the landscape can be a way of understanding what these conditions were. And so what I've borrowed from Masao Adachi is this idea, is that, I wake up on November 13th, 14th, but it could have been September 12th, 15 or 20 years ago. It could have been any day in Pakistan, in Beirut, in Aleppo. It could have been, sadly, sort of a daily occurrence in our life where these difficult to understand acts of violence that are generated by individuals. How do we make a piece about it? How do we make a work about it? How do we make a form about these events is the question that I'm asking myself. And so the idea here was simply to say, well, let's think about, let's look at a case of a young man who grows up in France in a particular urban context, who at some point in the course of his life feels like he is no longer, doesn't have a place in this landscape. And I mean landscape in the broad sense, not just geographic, but maybe political or social or spiritual. And decides that his future and perhaps that of his friends is to go away to a different landscape, which is the caliphate, which is Sham, to use the words that they use, somewhere in Syria. And eventually projects a destiny for himself in a completely different geography and social and political landscape. And so he leaves and he goes to Syria in 2012. And so to understand this departure or this journey, rather than turning the camera on him, I turn the camera on the landscape, but with a real open question. So to answer your question, what conclusions did I come to? I didn't. And I don't think it was actually my intent. I think if I had made a film that sort of answered this question, I think it would have been a horrible piece of art. It would have been very reductive. What I hope is that, I think that the point of the form is to make this proposition, again, the same proposition as Masao Adachi, which is to ask, what do we learn from this landscape and this story? And then to start a conversation, and either in some, in the spectator's mind. What I can tell you is that I deliberately did not choose an overly determined landscape. I could have chosen a really horrible social housing project. A kid who comes from a neighborhood where it's piss, graffiti, and drug dealers in front of every building. I did not do that. I chose what I consider to be a case of a man who left coming from a neighborhood that is in many ways a successful implementation of mixed housing, lower class and middle class, private public housing, a school that doesn't look like it was in the South Bronx in the 1980s. So many people would look at these landscapes in France and say that these are somewhat successful examples of integrated urbanism. So I wanted to turn the camera at these landscapes. The only conclusion that I did come to, but I think I had sort of some knowledge of this in the beginning, is that the real landscape that created the sense of exclusion was not physical. It's a doxa, it's an ethos. And I think that in the case of Aziz and his friends, what they did not find was a place where they could project themselves into a French future. And that's not a physical landscape. I think it's more of a spiritual, political, and social fabric that they felt did not have a space for them given their circumstances.
Thank you. Um, I would have 1,000 questions, but we're going to move on. Paul, as I think it was sort of introduced by Eric, it seems difficult to isolate the spaces of the reconstruction. When I call reconstruction, you know, post-war, it seems difficult to isolate the spaces, the built spaces of the reconstruction from the means of production, the mean of their production, the economy that produced them. So should it be considered as one single thing or form, the built and what does build? Instead, is it always, it is always portrayed and referred to only as a built environment. You know, it's like, you know, the suburbs. Or, is there, according to you, and I know you're not a specialist, according to you, is there a misunderstanding here? Is it really about, let's say, architecture or urban planning? What is at stake for you when we talk about the form of a city?
Thanks. Thanks for this really difficult, complex, theoretical question to begin with in 5 minutes. Okay. I think the question of the form of the city, I can quote the video, belongs to another world, an ancient world, because we have to think of the city in a historical view, and the city is not anymore a sovereign political entity, which has always been, and the market with a definite form. The city was that sovereign political entity and with a definite form. But I think with the reconstruction and the development of capitalism, so say, I said it, capitalism, with the development of capitalism, cities become something completely new. I mean, it's not a definite form with special functions. It becomes incorporated in a wider project of accumulation of capital. And you spoke about social fabric, and I think it's a really good concept. There is a Marxist, Italian Marxist of the operaism in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Mario Tronti, who built this concept of social factory in one of his best book, Workers and Capital. And what is a social factory? The basic idea is to say that factory is not just a place, it's not just a building, but it's a place which is in relations with a lot of other places in the city. For example, transports, houses, schools, and so on. And so for Tronti, we can't think about capitalism and factory just as one place, just as one building, but we have to think about the city as a social factory. It means that in the city, all we are doing is subsumed by the logic of capital. All what we are doing is in order to produce more capital and to make accumulation of capital possible. So that's the first point, I think. The form is completely determined now by this logic of capitalist accumulation. And in fact, the form of a city is not a good question anymore, I think. And the second fact about the recomposition of the city and the reconstruction, especially in France, is that in the 50s and 60s, the project of new cities, of suburbs, is a project which is really closed from the post-colonial and colonial project, which was in the colony, and especially in Algeria, in French Algeria. Why? Because you have to also the suburbs are built as places where we can put people from immigration, from post-colonial immigration, not only in order to make them work, but also to control them. and all the spaces of the suburbs is understood in this way. How to control people, control the bodies, control the way of living, and it's really interesting that some of the architects of this period and urbanists of this period were reading counter-insurrectionalist books. So the books which were written by the army, the French army during the colonial period, to think the way the colonial army could control the population, especially in Algeria, and the fact that the city is a project to control bodies and people, and also to make that any revolution, resistance, rebellions is become impossible. So I think that these two projects, this capitalist project and this post-colonial project, are together bound in the new form of the city, especially in France. And so the form is completely determined by these two projects.
Thanks. It's not a very lively thing yet because I'm the only one. It's gonna come. Tara. There's at least one important difference between a city like Rotterdam and a city like Paris. Rotterdam is what I was proposing is a territory that was designed, you know, like since it was wiped out, it could be rebuilt as a decision, and it's not an inherited, let's say, long process of construction. Whereas in Paris, it's the opposite. Like, despite the war, the city was the old city was kept, and whatever we call reconstruction occurred outside of the boundaries of the historical city. There are some cities also in the Netherlands where that similar thing, you know, Amsterdam is probably like this, where, you know, the post-war is actually on the suburbs too. So from where you're at, from your perspective, from what you do you think that the problems are linked with those questions of form? Are they linked to questions of new ways of building the city? Is there like he was saying, maybe the city used to be a question of form, I interpret, but used to be a question of form as a political body, and now it's a process of machinery or making capital. Is there such a distinction between two forms? And if I would, are the problems the same between those cities, whether it's Rotterdam or Paris? Or and if they're not the same, does the built environment really matter for the problems? You see,
yes, I think
it's
see
a question.
Where you're getting at.
Okay.
Well, I personally feel that the problems, if you would say problems, the way Rotterdam is shaped is really different from the way Amsterdam is shaped, for instance. And I think one of the results from that is that the way we live together here in the city is far more natural. So it's not like we have a historic center, and the more kilometers you get from the center, the more segregated it becomes. No, you get out of the station, you're right in the middle at the Kruiskade, and you're inside of the city, and everything's there. So we're a very multicultural city, and I feel that that's not something that you see it immediately when you come out of the station. And I feel that that's a big difference. That, for instance, in Paris, where you have the banlieues, you don't have slums like that, I think, in Rotterdam. And I think you do have them in Amsterdam. So in that way, I think the way cities formed are actually linked. And the fact that we have a lot of social housing in the center of Rotterdam actually is, I think, part of why I feel that this is the way a city should be. Like, I'm really happy with how it's shaped. And there are parts in Rotterdam, maybe in the south, which are slightly slum-like, if I could say that. I don't think Malique will agree. Will you agree? I don't know. Oh, we'll hear it in a bit. Yeah, he gets the next question. Sorry. I'm not trying to change the course of the. Yeah. So is that an answer to your question? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yay.
Do you know whether this this model for Rotterdam was a deliberate plan aimed towards integration, or was the integration just okay? I mean, but what's the history for those of us who don't know the history? Like,
well, it was a plan. So there was this specific plan from the Labour Party to have a lot of social housing in the center, and at one point a lot of housings, not just because of the bombings, but also just after the Second World War, there were these like really dodgy houses which didn't have bathrooms, or well, they had running water, but they didn't have bathrooms, and people, like when my mother came here, she was 18, I think, and she lived in Rotterdam, and it was about 40 years ago or something, and she had to like bathe in the sink, like there were no bathrooms, and they all tore down, and they made pretty cheap housings. Was it meant to integrate? I'm not sure, but what happened was that there came a lot of migrants, and a lot of the locals, local population, sort of fled to the outskirts of the city, and then it became not so very mixed. Is that an answer to your question?
Thanks. Malique, and then whoever wants. So for architects, this is all a bit disquieting. You know, for however violent the contemporary events are, they'll never have quite the capacity to erase the utopia that supported the production of these spaces. You know, these spaces were meant to do good. And, you know, a lot of memes were dedicated to try to do good. And there was, within the production of these built utopias, the form of a city was the form of it was a political form. Every time, you know, you would hear, if you take the debates, you know, sometimes they would say, okay, now you can even choose the form, you can choose where you put the walls. I don't know, like they were trying to work on the way this could collectively grow up, or so somehow these were built utopias. They were the construction of political bodies. But in your perspective, is there something to be learned about, with all these territories of post-war territories, about the construction of the attempt to construct utopia?
I guess I'll start with posing a question. Who gets to determine what a utopia looks like, or who has agency in planning? And I do believe, it's up for argument that the intention was right, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and because at the same time, the suburbs in Paris were constructed to control. We see a similar situation in Amsterdam with the Bijlmer, and the Bijlmer being southeast, where predominantly Afro-Dutch people live, and the west predominantly Turkish, Moroccan people in east as well. What we see is that in the post-colonial era, we wound up in a highly complex society. There was no, as far as I know, there wasn't a how to live together manual or booklet distributed. There probably were, but they were racist as fuck, basically. And yeah, for instance, and segregation. The irony was that in some theories, segregation was seen as a form of a modus to emancipate within their own construct, and that might be a good segue to let's square it off straight ahead. See, this city, in my perspective, is an anomaly. the city center got bombed, reconstruction commenced, and at the same time that the world was getting more globalized and mass migration commenced, etc., etc. And we saw what we call a white flight. People moving, and the incentive to move was, on the one hand, decent housing, but on the other hand, fleeing the blackening of the city, the darkening of the city. So it's an anomaly that this city is as multicultural as it is. But what's interesting to see is that the gentrification process that's been going on for quite some time is actually following, and we can see that in wherever in the Western world where highly ethnic diverse or ethnic diverse cities where gentrification is a modus for urban renewal, we see that the more poorer, thus colored people, because race and class are intertwined, of course, are getting pushed out to the outskirts and actually following the French model, the French post-colonial model of how to control black bodies or non-white bodies. And so let me try to reach back to a notion of a utopia. I think as the discrepancy in a multitude of perspectives, when white, no, let me just put it plain and simple. When white men and white people get to determine what a utopia looks like or what a city looks like, you end up with a situation where segregation is the prime mode where you can understand the city through. So I don't know. Let me say, just like the other speaker said, I don't know if I answered your question, but maybe I've risen a few.
Do you feel that Rotterdam, in the whole perspective of the whole Holland, is a very segregated city, or do you agree with me that, like, it's a bit more natural here than in other cities?
No, I don't agree. No, there isn't much you can, many cities you can put Rotterdam next to. There's only Amsterdam. You can say The Hague, you can say Utrecht, but no. But I do think that this city holds all the elements, the crude elements, in solving that big vraagstuk, that the big issue of equity and equality in the city, because all most Western cities, big Western cities, are struggling with that issue. How can we create a more equitable society? And what we see in the city is because of that anomaly, which has been being turned back because of gentrification, because of white people and their sense of privilege and sense of quality of life, etc., etc. But we do have all the building blocks, and that is infrastructure, a cultural landscape that's porous enough to adapt, and we're in that transition phase. But I do think, let me try to close off. I do think that we have the possibility of solving that question, and I've been to. I was trying to close it off, and I'm now branching off again. Excuse me for that.
I actually have another question as well.
Okay. I think you can take a break, guys. Just let's go. I'll try to wrap it up because I've been researching, because that was one of the first thing I wrote down, notions of who's a specialist, because I am a specialist when it comes to whiteness, because I've been studying white people quite some time now.
I was white.
Yeah. Your mind is thoroughly colonized, but we have some time to reverse some of those.
You know, after 2 words, right? After 2 words, you took two words.
Yeah. 2 words. I can. My scan is thoroughly. But anyways, I've been researching resistance against white power structures, and I was with a special interest in the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural revolution after the First World War and the Great Depression in the United States. And I believe that we're living through something similar today. We're actually living through a cultural revolution, because what we see in the city, a majority-minority city where 50% of the population and 75% of kids have an ethnic diverse background. And the parallels between the Harlem Renaissance and what happened there and here are quite astonishing. Because really, really briefly, the Harlem Renaissance got triggered by the abolition of slavery and the Great Migration that took, say, 4 or 5 decades after the abolition of slavery, where people, where African Americans, Africans or black bodies, moved from the southern states to the urban northern states. And the geographical distance between a Houston and a New York is quite similar to Marrakesh and Rotterdam. And what we see is that second and third generation migrants in this country and black bodies in the United States start to define their surroundings.
I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you.
Sorry. And thanks. It's just I just want to, and I'm sure we'll go back. Anybody wants to jump in before we move to the second? Sure.
Can I add? Yeah. And after me, can I have just something about the utopian project? I don't believe in utopian project from the top of the society. You know, when you are some architect and politicians who decide what is utopia, I don't think it could be utopian at all. And Le Corbusier said in a conference, revolution or architecture, and it means really clearly, if you don't make utopian functionalist modernist project in the cities, you have the revolution. So if you don't want the revolution, if you don't want insurrection, riots, you have to build architecture. And I think it was always in the spirit of the people who sought to this architectural project.
Okay. I'm going to have to speak a bit on behalf of the architects.
Can I just say, yesterday I was promised that the revolution would start today. So.
No, it's just like that's I think, and I will not, just to restate, not oversimplify. I think that what you're describing is, I think, very true for the beginning of the 20th century. But all of this reconstruction era, and I'm very critical about the role of architects in society. But there was a real attempt to have, let's say, I would not say diverse, but at least there was, in terms of thinking, they were, how do we say, transdisciplinary teams. You know, you had sociologists, you had like, so it was not only anti-revolution. Most of the people who actually were doing, you know, what's called the Team 10, you had counter-revolution, like insurrectional sort of architects. You know, that was a strong criticism of the utopia, but these were still alternative, more socially based, and they were the attempt to do something at a point where something needed to be done, right? So it's just, well, I don't want to hold the debate, but it's just, I think there's two projects of building social housing. There's the pre-war and post-war, and I think the post-war is a little more subtle, maybe not so much problem, but anybody wants to, maybe we can have a general Q&A in the end, or if someone wants to join in now. Yes?
I've noticed it's not really about facts, so I just want to put something.
Sure.
Can everyone hear me?
I think they're recording it, and so I think it would be nice if you could.
But I think the arguments to build something, or the reasons why spatial developments take place, is not necessarily based on combating revolution or stopping revolution. If you look at my facts, for example, the banlieue, or some places in Rotterdam, have been developed to give housing to public servants with all the services they needed and the space to live far from their work, which is a very social point of view. What we see in the capitalist city is that working becomes more and more, takes more and more place in your living. You go to work 10 hours a day, and when you're done, you go to a bar and they ask, what do you do for a living? So, you know, it's continuously. But my point is, another example why building or reforming the city based on your utopia is not based on combating revolution is, for example, as Tara told, new housing was necessary for hygiene purposes. So it was a labor or a social democratic idea to build new houses, for example. From the past, as Pasolini also illustrated, a new ruler wants to fade away the old heritage. That's a good reason to start new spatial developments. It's not about combating revolution. That's my point of view.
Thanks. If nobody wants to jump in, we'll move to the second video. I feel like a TV host, like a second TV moment. Where is it? Yeah, it's this one. This is going to be a little short, but you'll get, I think, the idea.
Oui. Parler comme des citations de vérité. C'est le père Brecht qui disait ça. Que les acteurs doivent citer.
Maintenant, elle tourne la tête à droite, mais ça n'a pas d'importance. Elle, c'est Juliette Janson. Elle habite ici. Elle porte un chandail bleu nuit avec 2 raies jaunes. Ses cheveux sont châtain foncé ou alors brun clair. Je ne sais pas exactement. Elle est d'origine russe.
Il y a 2 ans à la Martinique. Exactement comme dans un roman de Simenon. Non, je sais pas lequel. Oui, touriste de banane, c'est ça. Il faut que je me débrouille. Robert, je crois, à 110 000 francs par mois.
Maintenant, elle a tourné la tête à gauche. Mais ça n'a pas d'importance. J'en déduis que le pouvoir gaulliste prend le masque d'un réformateur et d'un modernisateur.
So that second moment is called what are the links between the construction of the city and the construction of the self? Tara, you're involved in the political debate through your writings about the urban life of Rotterdam. I know you're not an expert in this, in the meaning of all this, but a lot of pressure is placed on these spaces, like the reconstruction spaces, as being generators of social problems. Politicians attack the modern movement sometimes directly, accusing some, in France, quoting directly, attacking directly Le Corbusier as responsible for social problems, for the riots of the youth living in these urban parts. Does the construction of space really have such power over people, do you think? Like, from your experience, from what you see, from what you witness, from what you report?
Yes, there's this, I think, really beautiful theory about Rotterdam where someone who actually was part of the remodeling after the World War, his name is Arie van der Krocht, and he has this theory where when the city was bombed, people were actually like really, of course, sad. A lot of people died, but also they had to start working immediately. Like after 2 days, people were already building new things, and that there was this moment when there was a certain sadness, but at the same time, people should sort of buckle up and just get going. That there was like a shift in the identity of people who lived here, whereas sadness, there's no place for sadness, and they sort of laugh it away. I don't know if that's a saying in English, but where sadness and hard work sort of become intertwined, and working is a way to deal with everything or something. And this doubleness, or this sort of ambiguous identity, I think is still at the core of how Rotterdam is today. For instance, next year when Wilders will, our own right-winged guy we have here in Holland, will join the local elections, and he'll probably win. He's the biggest, well, not the biggest, but the people vote for him there. He's very popular in Rotterdam, and that saying that, and we have so many, like 175 different nationalities in Rotterdam. Like, this is a very ambiguous concept, I think. These two things live right next to each other. And I think that somehow, like, this sort of ambiguous identity is part of the form of Rotterdam. But I'm not really sure how. But is this a clear answer? I don't know. Did I make it easier? I don't know.
I think that ambiguous identity you're talking about creates a vacuum for a struggle, a power struggle. Who gets to be a Rotterdammer? Who is in and who is out? And furthermore, I think we need to ask more fundamental questions, such as what's the historical context of the wealth in the West? What's the historical context of this highly ethnic diverse society we live in? Like Chimamanda Adichie has written about and talked about a lot, the danger of the single story. As long as we don't allow and proactively make space for non-dominant perspectives, we'll live in a city where people actually think that ethnic minorities are gelukzoekers or guests. And there are some people who say, no, they're not gelukzoekers, it's incasso. They're actually following the wealth that has been extracted through centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. So if we want to understand this built environment, we need to re-evaluate the function of black and brown bodies within our city borders. Are they here to fulfill as decor in the progressive self-image of white people, for them being tolerated to live in these cities? Or do they have agency? Do they have the next question should be, are we willing to share in that power to make the institutions that make up the city as inclusive as the 174 nationalities we always talk about? So that power struggle of identity is in a fragmented city is in Rotterdam really, really...
I'm surprised that the question from the beginning of this discussion, even you, Eric, all sort of somehow discard the presence of those physical spaces as they are, as if they were not part of the problem, or not part of, you see, like you were talking about, like, and I would, as a Marxist too, I would agree that, you know, but like, what about those spaces? Like, you filmed them, like when you turn, you know, it's not, there is also, I know, like, okay, we have the important structure, we have everything of this, like, mechanism, but what about the spaces themselves? Like, are they totally discarded by this mechanism, or?
I think you could make the argument, and this is perhaps a bit of a polemical argument, but that the spaces themselves are irrelevant. What matters is the political system which generated their fabrication. And I'll give you an example. Like in the United States, because this is a different model, public housing was built in the 50s. So this is not a context of a new immigration. It's a context of dealing with black bodies that have been in the country for 200 years because of slavery, but they're already present. So it's a different dynamic than when you go and get people in the 1950s to rebuild Europe and bring them over in planes, and then you have to house them. In the United States, the people are here. The question is, where do you put them? And explicitly, and this is not sort of you know, conspiracy theory, when the social housing was built in the 50s, it was explicitly segregated, even though technically segregation was no longer legal. Even into the 60s, there are buildings that were built for white workers, and buildings and neighborhoods that were built. So it wasn't, the term black wasn't used, but everything was structurally made so that these social housings would be segregated, so that white workers would not live with black workers.
And redlining as well.
Pardon?
The practice of redlining.
Yes.
Allocating certain areas where financing was held back.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah. But then what happens is that, so the reason why I say it's possible to say that the building of the structures is irrelevant is because today, you know, there are very well-made working class housing that is today where architects and graphic designers, most of whom are white, want to live because they were really well-made spaces by famous architects, and this is where you would want to go live in Rotterdam or in New York or in Paris or in Marseille. You know, La Cité Radieuse, and it's full of upper middle class people now, right? But it was built as popular housing, whereas the displacement of bodies within the city escapes the architect. I mean, in New York would be another great example. There's the public housing where the black bodies were supposed to go live. There's also neighborhoods like Bedford-Stuyvesant, like that in the 1920s were Jewish neighborhoods. And then progressively income levels went down, so more and more brown and black bodies moved in, and so the white people moved out, and then this became the ghetto. But it was a beautiful ghetto. It was a beautiful brownstone houses, absolutely gorgeous architecture. But it suddenly became one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the United States, and so this was, and then up until the 90s, it became a black neighborhood. Even though it was built as a Jewish or an Italian neighborhood, and then it became a black neighborhood, and now 20 years later—
Because of policy.
Because of policy, but then also because of market structures and economic realities. Today, Bedford-Stuyvesant is becoming white again. Why? Because the brownstones are beautiful. And to speak of the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem is becoming white because the brownstones are beautiful.
And
right.
It's really interesting. I'm planning on writing an article where I draw some parallels between Brooklyn and Amsterdam in terms of gentrification, where that process has already, some say it's volbracht, it's finished, it's never finished, but in Harlem that process is relatively new, and that's I was interesting to make a parallel between Harlem and Rotterdam and Brooklyn and Amsterdam and see how people resist and where the dispersed black bodies go. Yeah.
And it reminds me, just in conclusion to this, there was an interview with Françoise Sagan, who was a writer, a somewhat radical so-called feminist writer, and she was interviewed, and somebody said, you know, it seems like you have in your lifestyle you have right-wing tastes, even though you are affiliated with a left-wing, thinking, and you hang out with Jean-Paul Sartre. And she says, everybody has right-wing tastes. It just means you want to have a good fucking life. And so in this sense, everybody wants to live in a beautiful brownstone and well-made architecture. The question is are the politics and the economic distribution of wealth and power make this possible or not?
And the individual sense of privilege. I deserve to live in a brownstone. I deserve to live in the city center in a beautiful house where I can hop through the city in my buck feet, and I'm entitled to that.
But sorry, Eric, but I want to push it. Right? Why then do you film the buildings? Meaning, hold on, because otherwise, why don't you do like Mark Lombardi, follow the money, structures? Why do you still look at the built environment? You see? And then Paul.
In part because when you go filming something, it doesn't mean that you want to demonstrate something within the frame itself. I mean, the conclusion of the film may very well be. Okay, there's a different way to answer the question. I think you make a film as a space in which people project something that comes from them. So, if you make a film as a set of answers, it's going to be a bad film. If you make a film as a space in which that shapes the nature of the context in which we think, but essentially, fundamentally, I think we are going to project something that comes from the spectator into the screen, which is why it's like a big net. It's a long object, like a fisherman's net. It catches these projections. So I've shown the film to people who have grown up in the projects and who felt like this was a very sort of touching film, that the story of the characters are very touching, are very endearing, are very, that it's sort of, they see the tenderness in the film. I've shown the film to people who did not grow up in the projects and who say, these buildings are horrible. Of course, anybody who lives in these is going to become, some kind of jihadi. And I think the point is that the camera is not going to resolve this. The question is, can you make the film sufficiently open to create a context where this discussion can be interesting? But as I said earlier, fundamentally, I do not believe that the problem is the buildings. I think the buildings help make life shitty, or rather the economic circumstances that forces people to live in buildings that are not pleasant places to live creates political realities and social realities, no question. But most young men from France who decide to go to Syria did not grow up in the worst projects, in the most piss-filled, graffiti-filled, drug-infested projects. Most of them come from places where they are able to move up structurally through good, decent schools and even make it to university, and then realize that there isn't a space for them in this general society. So the architecture I'm more interested in having us think about is the political architecture of the society itself through filming the physical architecture.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think what is important that the spaces matters, of course, but not spaces as built environment or form, but spaces as a place where some practices took place. I mean, some practices in which some relations of power are embodied. And I mean, you spoke about the riots in France. Since 81, there is no riots in France which did not begin by racist act of criminal police, of the police. Each riot begin always by the same thing. A policeman kill a young man, a young black man. Last month it was Theo who was raped in the streets by policemen, and it produced riots. So the fact is that what you call some problems, or I don't know, it's just always some practices in which there are struggles and confrontations between people which has power and people which hasn't power, and it's always that. And so, of course, spaces are really important, but as really institutional place, or place where where there are some practices of power. And another example in France, I think which is really important now, is the school. The high school, have a really important role in the suburbs, especially since 2004, when a law against the veil in school was the veil was in the parliament, and so since this time, the school in the suburbs play a role of interpellation of people, of Muslim people. Each day, some young women come and we say, no, sorry, you can't go with your veil, and because you are Muslim. So it's another institution, another form, and spatial forms, in which people are interpelled and transformed into subjects, really subject dominated, subjugated. So I think, yeah.
One question: is it a law that could be reversed, or is it something permanent?
No, I think it could be reversed, but it's really difficult. I'm I'm in an organization which want to change it, but yeah, it will certainly be depends on.
It's more interesting to focus on the climate where such a law is possible, rather than immediately looking for strategies of how we can get. And this is a typical Dutch Calvinistic way of thinking, straight to the solution. Okay, we have a problem. Let's move forward. What's the solution? But
I don't think it's to solve the problem. I think it's more like a symbolic thing, a Sarkozy symbolic thing, isn't it? From that period, the law. So.
Yeah, it's a complicated. That's a tough one.
I think it's not symbolic if you're wearing a veil. If your mother wears a veil, it's something really concrete.
It is. It's a religion choice. Yeah, that's not symbolic. But the law is something symbolic, isn't it? Who do you harm by wearing a veil?
But well, then all laws are symbolic. Like you see, like then all laws would be symbolic. I think. I have a question for you. I feel like playing cards. And in Godard's movie, Her is both Marina Vladi and the city. In your movie, one could claim that Jihadi is not only this young man, but the city itself. If we try to dig between determinism as the form of a city is responsible for the rise of terrorism, and the criticism of this determinism, saying where is free will within this scheme? As a political scientist, which is how you appear to me, with words, like what do you think? Where do you stand? What's going on?
The original film was called AKA Serial Killer, and when we decided to do the remake, we did not call it AKA Jihadi, we called it also known as Jihadi. And the reason to do that is to unfold the acronym, is because I think AKA has become such a part of our language and used in hip-hop culture and whatnot. We no longer think what it means. We always sort of assume that AKA means that I have two names. I have my name and then I have my AKA. But no, it means also known as, which means it's not who you are. It's what you are also known as. And the film is called Also Known as Jihadi because it is not a film about Aziz. First of all, Aziz is a pseudonym. We changed the name. It's not a film about this person. The film will probably not teach you very much about who this person is, but it will teach you a bit about what he is also known as, which is this moniker Jihadi, which is currently used and abused in ways that is very complicated. So I'm not pretending to make a film about Aziz or about a jihadi. I'm trying to create delineate the question as also known as jihadi. And so it's in that context that I'm looking at the city as a place that, so-called fabricates people who are also known as jihadi. But it doesn't tell us anything about who they really are. The second thing you raise is very important. and it's a central problem that I have with this so-called landscape theory, is that indeed it is a completely deterministic theory. I mean, it's both the beauty of it and the limitations of it, is that, you know, it's not because you grew up in a shitty neighborhood that you're going to become a serial killer or a terrorist, because that would mean that you have no agency. And we can't possibly, I can't admit to, no, however much of a materialist I can be, I refuse to think that that the surroundings determine who we are, because that's a very reductive way of looking at mankind. So I think the point is we become aware of the conditions in which somebody lives, the historical conditions, the narrative, the doxa, and this is absolutely something we factor in, but it doesn't smother, it doesn't eliminate agency. It shapes it, perhaps, but that's the discussion, I think. That's also the limitation of the landscape theory that I'm hoping that the film proposes itself. And I also think that, you know, everybody who has played around with this notion of landscape theory has always done so with as a proposition and not as a dogma. It's not a film that proposes, no landscape theory film proposes that this will help you understand. It proposes that you ask a few questions about the landscape.
To me, that's why I think you're still filming it, because it's, despite the materialist, the deterministic part, there is something more, or there's something other. There's something which still asks us to look at it again. That's why I would. I understand why. That's for me how I understand why you're still filming and not following the money. Third movie, unless someone wants to pop in. I told you, it looks like in terms of democratic thing, it is going to be a failure because but it's a first attempt, right? We'll do better next time. Third moment and last video. So this one is going to be a little more fun, I guess, because we didn't find the. Not that the topic is fun, we didn't find I didn't find, sorry, the subtitles, so we're gonna have to dub it live. So, who's gonna do this? Like, is it me or Eric or? Okay, you can do it. I'm sure you. We're okay. Okay, so, okay, let's do this. Oh, sorry.
So, do you want to just present what we're looking at?
Okay, I'm sorry, yeah. This is Le Joli Mai, the lovely month of May, I think it was translated, which is a movie by Chris Marker, the French filmmaker who died, I think, 2010 or something. This is, describe the movie as a whole, and I'll describe the scene.
I think it's just sort of looking at French society in this particular year and some of the big questions that it raises, and one of which is the construction of the banlieue, but also showing something that we don't usually talk about, which is that since Paris wasn't bombed during the war, the slums existed. They were destroyed as part of a program which was to destroy the slums and create the new buildings. And I'm assuming that what we're going to watch now is the sort of the moment of transition between the slums that look like favelas in Rio, that are being torn down, and the new buildings that people are being forcibly moved into, or not so forcibly moved into.
Yeah, that's exactly the scene. Okay, ready?
Vous êtes relogé?
Oui,
elle est là,
oui, je suis relogée.
Quelle impression ça vous a fait quand vous avez appris ça?
Ah, je sais pas, une impression de pleurer.
So how do we do this? Yeah, so this is, she says, like, this is a good news, and he's like, how did you react to this? Well, this is wonderful news. I was about to cry, right?
Yeah, because she's saying you're going to be relocated.
Yeah, you're going to be relocated. Yeah.
Vous avez vu à pleurer?
Ah oui.
Vous y attendiez
Je crois que
plus?
c'était le plus beau jour qui pouvait m'arriver.
It's the most beautiful day in my life. I was about to cry.
Depuis combien de temps vous attendiez?
Depuis 7 ans.
How long have you been waiting for? 7 years.
Alors, vous aviez fait une demande à la municipalité?
Oui. Et puis on attendait toujours. Et puis un beau jour, eh ben, j'ai un monsieur gentil qui s'est occupé de moi.
We made a request to the municipality, and a nice man who's taking care of
Finally,
our case.
we were waiting on, and suddenly a very nice man came to take care of me.
Et puis dernièrement, mercredi, j'ai reçu une feuille comme quoi j'étais relogée. Alors j'étais tellement contente, je crois que j'en aurais pleuré.
And so I learned Wednesday that I was going to be relocated. I was so happy that I was about to cry.
Le facteur qui vous a apporté ça?
Oui, il a même attendu pour savoir la nouvelle.
Even the postman waited until she arrived so that he could give her the envelope because he knew she would be happy.
Ah, il a attendu que
Oui,
vous
il a
ayez-
attendu que je regarde la feuille pour savoir si c'était bien pour être relogé ou alors si c'était encore pour me dire d'attendre. Et quand il a su que c'était pour être relogé, il était aussi heureux que moi, je crois bien.
Et c'était au-
So the postman waited for her to open the envelope to see if it was, another letter saying that she had to wait more, or whether it was the final answer that she could move.
courrier du matin?
And he was as happy as she was that she was able to be relocated.
Oui, au courrier du matin.
Alors vous avez eu toute la journée à attendre le retour de votre mari?
Ah non, parce qu'il rentre à manger midi.
Alors à midi,
Alors,
vous
quand
avez-
il l'a su à midi, il était aussi heureux que moi.
Comment-
So you had to wait all day long to tell your husband, no, he comes to eat at lunch, so I could tell him for lunch, and he was as happy as I was.
ça s'est passé?
Il en a
Comment
pas-
vous lui avez dit ça?
Ben, je lui ai rien dit. La table était préparée et je lui ai mis l'enveloppe dans l'assiette. Et quand il est rentré, il a bien vu qu'il y avait une lettre dans l'assiette. Il s'était à peu près douté. Mais
So she put the letter in her husband's plate at lunch so that he could open it almost like a present.
enfin, il n'était pas tout à fait sûr. Et quand il a lu la lettre, il était heureux, aussi heureux que moi.
Et il était de bonne humeur quand il était arrivé?
Oh oui, il est toujours de bonne humeur comme ça. Mais alors, ça l'empêchait de manger.
She's just like, oh, was he happy? And yeah, well, he's always happy.
Il n'a presque pas mangé le midi, lui.
Alors vous ne le connaissiez pas ce logement?
Non, non.
Vous saviez
l'a
juste qu'il y avait un logement qui vous a été attribué?
On a juste, oui. c'est tout ce
Alors
que
vous
je
êtes
savais.
allé le visiter?
Oui, hier.
Hier.
So yesterday they went to go see the new place for the first time.
Which they didn't know.
Hier matin.
Alors vos impressions?
Oh, je sais pas. Quand je suis rentrée et que j'ai vu ces grandes pièces, je croyais être perdue.
So she felt like the spaces were so big she was almost lost in them.
Je croyais que je sais pas, je me faisais pas une idée que c'était comme ça.
I couldn't imagine that kind of thing existed.
Il y a 3 chambres,
Three
une salle de
rooms.
séjour, une cuisine, une salle d'eau, les water,
So 3 rooms, a bedroom, like bedrooms,
Kitchen,
kitchen,
toilets.
Yeah.
une entrée et des grands placards que je sais même pas comment je vais tout arranger parce qu'on est tellement peu l'un sur l'autre.
And so many closets that I don't even know how I'm going to fill them with.
Oh, mais vous allez trouver
Oh
l'emploi.
oui, oui, il est bien arrivé à tout casser.
But
Est-ce
yeah,
que
we're
vous
gonna-
pensez déjà comment vous allez installer ça ou vous allez
Ah
mettre
oui,
les
oh, oui,
enfants?
oh, oui, on a déjà fait un peu de projet avec le mari. D'abord, depuis mercredi, on fait que parler de ça. Il y a
So
rien de
since
sur
they got the news, they're planning on how they're going to, inhabit the space.
Attention, tout est sur le logement.
Dans ce nouveau logement, est-ce que vous pensez que votre vie privée sera plus agréable?
Ah
Do you
oui,
think your private life will
c'est
be
bien
more
pensé.
pleasant?
Il y aura un changement de vie.
Ah, c'est bien pensé, devant les enfants, on peut pas faire ce qu'on veut. Tandis que là,
Yeah, because it's going to be more pleasant because in front of the children we can't do everything.
ils sont dans leur chambre, nous dans la nôtre, on sera tranquille.
Now they're going to have their own bedroom, we're going to have ours, and we'll be calm, we'll be tranquil.
We can do our thing.
C'est le moment de le dire, on va se sentir jeune marié bientôt.
Vous avez combien d'enfants?
J'ai 8 enfants
How
et une
many
petite
kids-
nièce
how
en
many kids
adoption
do you
depuis un
have?
mois.
She has 8
Comment ça,
kids.
une nièce en adoption?
Ben, nous avons perdu une belle sœur qui a 6 enfants. Alors dans la famille, on s'est débrouillé pour placer les enfants.
Et vous aussi, vous avez pris un...
Oui, j'ai pris une petite fille de 9 ans.
So they have 8 kids, and her sister-in-law had 6 kids, and she passed away. So they sort of distributed the other kids
Then she
between
has
different
one,
people
yeah.
in the community.
9 enfants,
J'ai
donc,
9
ici,
enfants.
et vous deux avec votre mari.
Oui.
Alors comment est-ce que vous vous arrangez pour vivre dans cette pièce?
Ah ben j'ai un lit dans la chambre, un grand
So
lit
that's how they live
où je
now.
couche 4 enfants. J'ai un petit lit cage où j'en couche 2.
So there's
J'ai un
4
tout petit
kids
lit
in
où je
this
couche
room,
ma toute
plus
petite.
4
Et j'ai
kids
cette
in the
petite
bed,
là
2
qui
in
couche
the
avec moi
cribs.
dans la salle à manger. C'est entre moi et mon mari.
and then the others in the dining room with them and the other kids. So there's 9 children altogether.
Alors quand un enfant tombait malade,
Eh ben, il restait là, mais il pouvait pas se reposer.
So when one kid gets sick, I don't know what you say.
Yeah, they rotate the beds.
Yeah,
Qu'est-ce
they
que tu
rotate the
penses
beds.
de ta chambre? Réponds. Qu'est-ce que t'en penses? Elle est belle? Comment tu vas être?
C'est mieux parce qu'on aura plus chaud.
T'auras plus chaud, mais t'avais chaud, t'étais à 4. Tu vas mieux dormir.
Oui,
Oui, ça.
Ça, c'est la chambre de vous 3.
Oui, des 3 garçons.
That's the room for the
Voilà.
3 boys.
Alors maintenant, on va aller voir la salle des filles.
Now we're gonna go see the one from the girls.
Voilà, c'est bien. Là, ça va être ta chambre. Qu'est-ce que tu en penses? T'es heureuse? T'es contente d'avoir ta chambre à toi? Oui. Oui?
Are you happy to
T'auras
have
pu
your
aller
own
coucher chez mes mères?
room?
Hein? Tu as pu avoir sortir le soir?
C'est embêtant pour vous de les coucher chez.
Surtout quand il y a eu les Arquis là, qui étaient tout de suite derrière chez nous, elle avait beaucoup peur parce qu'elle n'osait pas passer devant. Alors tous les soirs, il fallait la conduire. Là,
She
là,
was
elle
scared
avait vraiment
to
peur.
walk into some part of the neighborhood, so she had to be walked by her parents or something. So
Oh, dis
now she can go out. She will be able to go out on her own, apparently.
ton chewing-gum. Non, mais ça.
Et l'école, ça reste la même école ou ça change d'école?
Ah, bah, jusqu'à la fin de l'année, ça va rester la même école.
Et après, vous vous approchez.
Oui, après, ils vont venir ici à l'école.
Ça vous ennuie là, de changer d'école?
Oui, oui, oui.
Non.
Mais c'est juste après, en fait,
Tu es
c'est
un
juste là.
instituteur, t'es un professeur, non?
J'en descends.
Non, c'est une maîtresse.
Tu es maîtresse.
Just
Ça
a
t'ennuie
couple of
d'être sûr d'en
seconds.
avoir une autre ou
So then we're gonna go visit the new place.
de faire rien?
Non plus. Maman, c'est une maîtresse. C'est une maîtresse.
That's the new place.
Les garçons nous regardent tous.
Ah, bah, bien sûr, t'es pas connu là. Ah, regarde, tu vois, il y a tout le monde nous regarde.
Non, tu vois sur la tour.
Dis donc, tu t'aurais pas mis comme ça à la fenêtre là-bas, il n'y en avait pas, hein.
You couldn't have gone looking through the balcony in the other place because there was no
T'es
balcony.
heureuse, toi? Ah, j'ai
On la voit pas. On la voit pas d'ici.
Ça a été la première chose que j'ai fait, j'ai ouvert la porte et je me suis trouvée dans la cuisine. C'est ça?
On la voit là. On la voit pas d'ici.
Ah non, elle est pas de ce côté-là, elle est de l'autre côté. École?
Oh, l'école. C'est la rue qu'on voit.
Allez, soyez sages, hein, puis tombez pas par terre.
Veux-tu?
Hein? Qu'est-ce que c'est que tu dis?
Regarde la statue là-bas.
Ah oui, tu vois, il y a une statue. Avec une étoile. Et puis une étoile.
Oh, il a deux vélos accrochés.
All right. Thank you, Eric, for the live. Okay. So, after the war, Malique, we moved from a way of making city without architects, mainly, let's say, on the long and slow span of time, to a production of mastered, designed territories, built upon will. There was this sort of discourse of voluntarist discourse and ideas. This asks a thrilling question to whomever is in a position of attempting to do better. Because these, as Eric said when we first discussed, we're still continuing on producing policies to try to better things, and this is still going on. That's it. I understand you personally understand you as being a poet. I don't know how you would categorize yourself, but amongst other things. I don't know if so. Pasolini, as another poet, said, "Organization is the death of sentiment." Once we have beautiful wills, but as soon as we try to organize them, the original intent gets lost. For you, what can be said about this distance between the original intentions and their failures?
Great question. What can be said? Let me try to summarize it.
Just because I think you have been very clear about the who is making, and I think all of this is valid and remains, but imagining that now we go beyond and make it even more inclusive, like, or inclusive at all, in the decision process. The problem between intention and embodiment might still be the same, or not. How do you...
I don't think there's a problem with the loss of intent. I think we're human beings, and with all our shortcomings. So I don't think that that the eventual goal of should overclips or overshadow the intent, because I totally agree that it's not, in a sense, the physical spaces, but it's the political intent behind the spaces. And segregation in the United States also brought forth the HBCUs, the historical black colleges and universities, where safe spaces, where black critical thought had the space to cultivate. So segregation in itself isn't a problematic thing. It's the how power gets distributed, where the problems arise. And will we lose some meaning in when we try to transform our ideas into physical spaces or physical? Of course. And is that a problem? I think that's what makes us human. But how do we converse together, or how do we talk about the city and the spaces we envision? As long as that is segregated, the outcome will be more problematic. I think that in the most ideal situation, it's how can we reduce exclusion? How can we can't ban exclusion, we can't ban systems of exclusion, but we can sure as hell try and proactively move towards a situation where the harm that's been done by planners, by policymakers is reduced. I don't know if it's in any shape, way, or form an answer to your question, but it's an attempt.
Thanks.
So why are you against the, or were you very against the woonvisie, for instance, where like certain parts of Rotterdam where the local government tries to make a more balanced representation of the city by creating new housings, like not only like more how do you say this, higher income housings. Yeah, we had a referendum. I think people who are here probably know it, but we had a referendum because of the demolition of very cheap slum housing, and to rebuild housings for slightly higher incomes. And you were against this, but I don't, like, you talk about how things should be restructured, but I think it's a good thing. Like, I voted for the demolition of the houses, and you were really against it.
God save your soul.
but like, how can there be progress and change without interference?
I'm not anti-interference, but we should critically engage the woonvisie. It's been formulated by white people for white people, and
why do you hate white people so much?
Because they're white. There's something in the color of this. No, of course, it's race and class are intertwined, and when it means that transforming an environment, when it means that transforming the environment means to bring in more white people, we reproduce systems of exclusion. And I think that to try to answer because these are, to try to answer your question again, these are big questions, and which I would like to ponder longer on before actually trying to give an answer. But the notion that we're autonomous beings and that living in color blindness, that someone white can develop something for non-white people, and color and race doesn't matter, it's a farce. And as long as we don't engage those blind spots adequately, and we'll have a conversation that will go in circles. And the woonvisie is fucking problematic, because what it does is it creates, and even if you don't even have to take my word for it, look at the promo video, the commercial Leefbaar Rotterdam made to promote the woonvisie. You've seen it yourself. It was published on, I wrote an article for Vesbeton. You've seen the commercial. There's this big, okay, let me give you a play-by-play. It's an animation. It's a before and after animation. Before, it's all messed up, ghettoized and fucked up, and etc., with a big mosque in the backdrop, subtly, subtle. Yeah, my God, come on. And the after, it was all nice, and the Dutch flag, and happy cartoon people, and where a few black bodies were included as a form of brownwashing, tokens to retain that sense of moral equity. So asking the question why the woonreferendum is a problematic plan is idiocy.
But let's talk about it. Okay, so all that this put aside, I mean,
the big mosque.
No, but the idea, I think, of having a city that is mixed, that you don't have these neighborhoods which are only black or Polish or only Turks or Moroccans, I think it's a positive thing if you try to mix it up. Like, I live in Delfshaven, and it's really really. Why?
It's a naive way of thinking. Let kumbaya, Hindustani person, Somali, French, and let's all sit together and of course.
Well, we're fucking doing it, aren't we?
Yeah, but it's good. It's fun. But the point is that it's a question of power. What's the sense of living together and praising that multiculturality, while that multiculturality is a decor for a white bourgeoisie, and the white people that celebrate that diversity. Oh yes, Rotterdam is so highly diverse, Roti, Kapsalon, etc. People actually use these. It's not a euphemism. People actually use this as an argument. But what they do is they send their kids to white schools, all the way on the other side of the city. So it's.
No, but the problem, yeah. Well, it's a big.
Time for a break.
No. What I'm saying is, there's one thing that's kind of troubling to me, because we're trying to talk about. I think, to put it in your words, you said, like, for instance, in Rotterdam, unlike in other cities, maybe there is more the capacity to, there's the good parts to be rearranged. What is very strange is that it's a very market-based city. You know, it's not like this sort of, liberal, democratic, planning, social. No, it's really like, if you look at the, it's a business city, right? So. That's kind of a little tricky to me too, and I have no answer. But it's just like this idea of it's a free market. Like, if you take the way the planning is based, or the way it's done, or like it's really, there's an empowerment of companies that is very strong, and so
businessmen redesigned the city.
I guess my question is, if I try to narrow it down, is that in some way, as you eloquently said in the beginning, there's a machine which is a capitalistic system, but it is very much at work in the making of the city, and this might be the reason why the parts are moving differently here, or is it? You see? Because this it's not, this is really a market, a free market.
And the market is racist as well. Power and race are intertwined.
Yes.
So if we think that the market is the solution for everything, we keep on reproducing.
I'm not saying this. I would not advocate for this. I'm saying that this city maybe the specificity of this city is that it's more marked by free market than the others, which are based on former forms of political system that were, based on the political form, right? That were more democratic and all this. So this one, which seemed to be potentially more inclusive, is actually based on the negation of, or a more, you see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
this, am I the only one living this contradiction, or what appears to me as a contradiction?
Yes. No, but I don't know. I don't know Rotterdam, so it's complicated to answer. But I don't know why it could be contradictory to say that it's a capitalist place. I mean, the logic of capital accumulation and the racial logic are two logics, always or sometimes intertwined, but not always, not in a schematic ways. So I don't, yeah.
I mean, even the suburbs, and I mean, it's a different level of capitalist decision making. But all that social housing we just saw in this film by Chris Marker was made from a state capitalist perspective. In other words, after the war, we needed to rebuild. We didn't have enough workers in France, so first we moved people from the slums to these cities, and then we sent airplanes to Morocco, to Algeria, to sub-Saharan Africa to fill them with workers that we sent to the mines, and then we had to house them. So we built the housing. I mean, it's not like we built the housing to solve a housing issue. We built the housing to solve an economic issue, a capitalist within a capitalist framework. So it's whether it be individual private developers in Rotterdam who want to make a real estate coup by sort of demolishing certain structures and rebuilding others and possibly make a profit, or whether it's the state building these sort of large structures that can cheaply house families for workers. It's always based on the necessities of the market.
Okay. Paul, that will be the last question, for me at least. So you're a bit of a mystery to me, I have to say, because you articulate a deep Marxist approach. Your work is about global history, you analyze systems, and one could claim that your concerns are the ones, or methods are the ones that have been very criticized by both post-colonial writings, for instance, and at the same time, you are, in France, I can say, one of the most precise and strong advocate of post-colonial activism. You've been exposed also to, but you're a strong, at least you're part of the debate and took difficult stances. So the construction of the city, the post-war city, is caught, I believe, in the tension between those two sides, I think. This idea of systemic, top-down, and the socialist utopia, let's say, and the massive, on the other side, at the same time, the exclusion, the control of the other, let's say, I would put, the colonized, or and which was very, so I think the contradiction that I see in you, in the way you articulate both, we can see it in the city, or in the construction of the city, right? So how do you reconcile those? Is again, am I the only one seeing the contradiction? And whatever you do to articulate those two, is it a horizon to articulate them in the city, or you see what I'm saying?
Can I have another question? Sure. No, it's really complicated. I don't have any answer. The first point maybe is that I don't think we are always obliged to articulate things. I mean, in the obligation to articulate struggles, to articulate class conflict and racial conflict, you have always an ancient problem with the radical left, which is to say, okay, the class problem is the most important problem, and feminist, racial problem are secondary problems. And always when you want to articulate things, I mean, you can have the idea to say, okay, so one of the problem is more important than the other. I think it's not necessary to articulate in political way. I mean, it's really the point of one of for me, an important organization, anti-racist organization in France, which is the Parti des Indigènes de la République. I don't know how to translate it, but Republic, yeah.
Party of the Republic's indigenous populations,
Yeah.
which is the term used by the colonizer to describe the colonized bodies.
Yeah, and their point is to say, okay, we don't want to articulate for now. We have our struggles, you have yours. Yeah, let's go to struggles together sometimes, but articulating is sometimes complicated. So that's in the strategic perspective. It's not an obligation to articulate. But I mean, ontologically, in the logic of the domination, of course, I mean, capital reproduction and accumulation is based on racial domination, and the racial domination reproduce also capital accumulation. I mean, that's exactly what you said earlier. I mean, the global history of capitalism is a history of the production of black bodies, of non-white bodies, which has to be exploited to the accumulation of capital. So we could say that racism, as we know today, is almost a production of the capitalist history, like of the domination of the center of the capital world to the rest of the world.
If I might add, yes. If I might add, racism is at the core of Western civilization. Colonialism is at the fundament of all the institutions that have been built the past 400 years. We're living in remnants of colonial empires, but we seem to forget that. We seem to erase that when we're confronted with a highly ethnic diverse city as Rotterdam and Paris. And people are flabbergasted, like, why are they going to Syria? Like, what is this? We welcomed them. We've tried to civilize them there, but okay, let me not go all the way there. But we need to come to terms that the society and civilization that we live in now is built on black and brown bodies. And as long as the conversation, and I know it's a painful conversation, but let's not that's at least what I try. I don't try to engage it from, I'm not trying to play a blame game, but if we focus on processes of exclusion and the historical context of the wealth that has been accumulated, that is the departure point for the ultimate conversation for a more equitable society. Yes, and I do hate white people, to answer your following question.
So if economic growth is at the core of racism, I think this is, yeah. No, the other way around, right? I think the search for economic growth is at the core. So this is when we start the communist revolution, right? I think.
Well, the revolution...
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we're done.
Well, it's funny because personally, just what I was, I spent some time in the south side of Chicago, and there was a lot of African Americans. Mainly, I was the only white guy, which I've never been a minority. So it's been a very strong experience for me. And but when I got back of it, after a lot of discussions, I still think that the communist revolution is at least as a horizon, is supposedly colorblind as a system. That's what it aims to be. Whereas all the debates I had were still, I think, not colorblind. But the question then becomes whether, as you said, should we or should we not be colorblind? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, in a conclusive sort of manner, tomorrow is a big election in France, and I think corollary to this whole discussion is this other phenomenon, which is this sort of the monstrous rise of right-wing populism and across Europe and the United States, all the way to the White House, and I think it's almost sort of like the flip side of this conversation, which is, you know, democratic countries with histories of long-standing democracies like England, the United States, France, you know, voting majorities for somewhat explicitly racist agendas, whether it be Brexit, which is a referendum that's formulated in racist terms, whether it be the victory of Donald Trump, which is formulated in racist terms, and, you know, we'll see what happens tomorrow. But one thing I would like to say, I mean, I think it's extremely important to try to dissect to understand why this is happening within a democratic context, and I would posit that it's extremely important for the left to think long and hard about what the left has done in the past 25 years that has made this possible. And one thing that I would say is that if the problem is the nature of this collective project that we call France, for example, that's sort of, I mean, I can only speak of France because I don't know the situation here. The nature of the collective project called France has necessarily the elements that constitute this collective project called France has changed in the past 50 years for a number of reasons which we understand probably within the left, but which we have not accepted necessitate a reconfiguration of this collective project called France, which can no longer just rest on the ideas that date from 1789 and that we, you know, sort of hypocritically call, you know, universal values. But I really think that this is an important thing, because this collective project, if it is not recalibrated, leaves the door wide open to these populist discourses on the right, which essentially say we need to go back to this white version of our collective dream, and we either kick the brown bodies out or force those that stay to be whitewashed and to believe in exactly the same values as ours, and to refuse the idea that multicultural population equals multicultural collective project, and that necessarily changes the nature of the collective project called France. And the left has not been willing to engage in this discussion. And in that sense, the left is enormously responsible for not providing answers to this monster.
Yeah. And in order I'll really keep it brief this time, is are we willing to give up our own comfort for the sake of a more equitable society? Ask yourself that, because it's a predominantly white audience once again. Huh? Yes, of course, and I'm here to disrupt the comfort. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, sorry. But that's, to make it personal, are we willing, are you willing to give up personal comfort in order to move towards a more equitable society? And that's the conversation the left should be having.
Don't need to answer right now.
Okay, well, no, do you want to take? Yeah, sure.
No, I had a really interesting conversation with Malique before we sat down, and they basically, I think the conversation was this. You asked me this question as well, like, are you willing to give up some of your comfort living in this white paradigm, which I'm living in, basically, and I told you I wasn't ready yet, but maybe I'll give it a try.
So,
I'll start.
Sorry. The situation, your situation is even more complex, because what is the significance of a black body in a predominant white society? When there's a dominant culture that you have to verhoud jezelf tegen ten opzichte van, way up against. The internal conflict forces you to take one or two paths. Let me try to make it into a binary thing. No, hold on. I'm trying to finish my point. That, and I'm not a psychologist. I haven't. This is a loose theory, loose idea that some individuals, the psychological predisposition of some individuals, it's easier to not go against the grain of the dominant society. Hence integration. But integration and assimilation are insufficient terms if you ask me, because you're missing a racial component. You're not assimilating or integrating into something ambiguous. It's something specific. And that's why it's a Dutch term I like to introduce, which is totaliseren. It's niet integreren, but totaliseren. Tata is the slang term for white people, like crackers, honkies, and trying to make that as like Fanon wrote brilliantly about black skin, white mask, and the psychological implications of trying to cope with that trauma of migration. And I think that that's a big quest for you. Maybe you should.
I think I have to find a new boyfriend because it's part of my post-colonial trauma.
Yeah, but
I have a white boyfriend who's sitting over there, by the way.
One thing I want
it's
to
your
know,
fault, sir. Once again, the white man has done it again. Okay, thank you.
All right, so it's 4:58. 3:58. We're supposed to close at 4. One thing I was willing to say about what you said, and authoritarianly, that will be the last word. No, it's just that the left, it's the left, and that leads to the next discussion we're going to have to Paris. It's the left who built those spaces, you know? So anyway, thank you very much. I hope you liked it. And there's another event, discussion at 4:30, right? In half hour. I leave you.
Yeah, so we have the second part of the conference starting at 4:30. And if you could take your things with you, because we have to rearrange the room for this next part. Thank you.
Thank you.